Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out why tiny New Zealand is so good at rugby.
In September 2023, these 20 countries will participate in the biggest tournament of one of the world's most popular sports, rugby. And you could make a strong argument that one of these 5 teams will win it. England invented the sport and has reached the World Cup finals 4 times. South Africa won the last World Cup in 2019. Ireland is currently ranked number 1 in the world, and France is hosting the tournament. Then there's New Zealand, who might win because, well, they're the most dominant team in the history of rugby, and arguably in all of sports history.
Wow. Okay, so yeah, I recently just started watching rugby, and the first rugby game I watched was England versus South Africa this past Saturday. For the Rugby World Cup. England lost by 1 point. I was going for England. But I also watched some highlights from a game, I think it was between France and New Zealand, and the New Zealanders were hardcore. Not that France wasn't, but New Zealand just seemed to have a little extra something.
And arguably in all of sports history.
And the All Blacks are the world champions for the second time.
Since 1903, the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team has only lost to 7 countries, but has a comfortable winning record against all of them. That's all the more impressive when you take into account that New Zealand today only has a population of 5 million people, a fraction of the other countries that have made a World Cup final.
Very unique, obviously, for us to dominate.
Wow, look at those stats. Argentina's only beaten them twice. Wales has only beaten them 3 times.
A fraction of the other countries that have made a World Cup final.
Very unique, obviously, for us to dominate the world because we are a very small part of it.
There is a fervent following of this team, almost religious at times.
Yeah.
So it begs the question, how did such a tiny country create such a dominant sports team? And can the New Zealand All Blacks stay on top?
Rugby combines the less placid features of American football and English soccer. You can run, pass, or kick the ball, while at the same time protecting yourself from the combined assault of the enemy.
Rugby is a fast, violent, and
assault.
chaotic sport with many rules, but one basic premise. Get the ball to your opponent's end of the field.
Right.
The modern form of the game was invented at a school in Rugby, England, around 1820. At the time, England had a world-spanning empire, and it introduced rugby to its colonies, like South Africa and Australia in the 1860s, then New Zealand in the 1870s, where it became especially popular.
When rugby came to New Zealand, it came from origins in the UK where it was very much related to class structure. The elite schools played rugby in the UK.
Okay.
Tony Johnson is a rugby expert, author, and TV broadcaster in New Zealand.
Welcome back, and Caleb Clark is in.
When it came to New Zealand, it really was the game for everyone. It didn't matter where you came from, what school you went to, you had a go at this game.
That included New Zealand's indigenous population, the Maori. They formed rugby teams almost immediately, and as early as the 1880s, a mostly Maori rugby team called the Natives played matches in other countries.
It was indeed a Maori person, Tom Ellison, who first came up with the idea of New Zealand wearing this black jersey.
Those jerseys are how New Zealand's national team came to be known as the All Blacks. And in 1905, they set off across the ocean to play matches, which, when played between countries, are called tests. The All Blacks surprised everyone by playing a faster, more expansive, and far more organized style of rugby than had ever been seen before.
Oh, really?
They played
So they kind of reinvented the technique of rugby. That's impressive. I guess that's how you win. Strategy.
They played 35 tests, and they only lost once. A success that not only changed rugby, but also how the world saw New Zealand.
New Zealand was starting
Wow.
to search for its own identity. This was the start of it. This was New Zealand, not so much a British subject anymore, but our own people.
After the tour, the All Blacks embodied that new national identity by fusing rugby with New Zealand culture, most famously by performing a Maori war dance called the haka before every
I
test.
saw them do that. Yeah, okay. Wow. So New Zealand literally changed the game of rugby. And I have seen them do this before. I saw this in that highlight reel I was talking about.
Performing a Maori war dance called the haka before every test.
I think initially the haka was a greeting, also a challenge, often performed before a battle. Some people feel that the haka gives the All Blacks an unfair advantage. It's psychological.
Yeah,
In
probably.
1924, this All Blacks team won all 32 tests on an overseas tour, earning them the nickname the Invincibles. They raised New Zealand's expectations for the All Blacks from simply winning to dominating world rugby.
The superlative All Blacks rugby machine. They once more confirmed their absolute supremacy. World champion. The New Zealand war machine, all set to join the other nations who've fallen before the invincible All Blacks.
Wow. So what I'm gathering is that a lot of it has to do with the psychology of the team members. They have the whole culture of New Zealand behind them. So I could see how the team could be a religion. That makes sense.
According to data gathered by ESPN, between 1900 and 1989, the All Blacks won 71% of their tests. In 1987, they won the first ever Rugby World Cup. Then from 1990 to 2009, the All Blacks achieved a staggering 80% win rate.
Wow.
When they did lose, they always turned things around by developing new strategies.
You know, we're not the biggest people in the world. The South Africans produced these giants. England, a very sort of gym-trained muscularity about them. But what we do have is a combination of athleticism, skill, but also be willing to try something just a little bit out of the ordinary.
More than 100 years after it started playing rugby, this small country of a few million people was still producing the best rugby players in the world, year after year. So how does New Zealand do it?
It's the fact that it is our national game, so kids are playing it from when they're small, boys and girls.
Okay.
Alice Soper is a rugby player and journalist.
You can be 6, so 5 or 6, and they play something called rugby, which is like a primer to the tackle, where they have flags on their shorts.
In America, we have flag football, and it's the same thing.
Rugby teaches kids how to run, pass, and catch, and it's how New Zealand maximizes the number of people who try rugby, thereby maximizing the pool of talent, entering a pipeline that feeds the All Blacks. By the time kids turn 13, they're playing tackle rugby and join club and school teams. Many high schools, called colleges in New Zealand, field multiple teams, again, to keep as many playing as possible. But the best boys play on their school's top team, where the best of the best are increasingly identified as potential future All Blacks.
You could almost liken it to college sport in the United States.
You're watching Land Rover Fit.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like American football. Kids start really young, although lately a lot of parents are pulling their kids out of American football programs and putting them into soccer programs or European football programs.
You're watching Land Rover Fest 15 Rugby, where we show you the stars of tomorrow today.
That would be intimidating, but I don't think it's unfair because the other teams could do it too. There's nothing from stopping them. Maybe cultural appropriation, I guess, but they could come up with their own chant.
Then after graduating, the best are hired by teams to play in New Zealand's professional rugby league, Super Rugby. Only professional players that play in New Zealand are eligible to reach the top level, the All Blacks. It's a way for the team to ensure that there is a constant stream of new players that learn the game the New Zealand way.
They have to be all things, so they've got to be able to kick, they've got to be able to run, they've got to be able to tackle.
There's an expectation that they will play rugby the way the New Zealand public expect to see them play, which is this rather flamboyant style.
Possibly the greatest generation of All Blacks ever played from about 2010 to 2016. Over that time span, they won 90% of their tests and never lost at home. Plus, they won 2 more World Cup championships. Several players on the 2015 team played at the same schools, and they all played for one of 5 Super Rugby teams.
Probably the most well-known would be Richie McCaw. He was your typical kind of hard man, absolutely no fear going into the contact.
Daniel Carter, for example, who was like the Joe Montana of the All Blacks. He was a brilliant player, but he was a great strategist as well.
Did he just kick the ball and then grab it in the end zone? Was that on purpose? I think it was on purpose.
Montana of the All Blacks. He was a brilliant player, but he was a great strategist as
That's
well.
smart.
But while the top of the pipeline gets all the glory, New Zealand's real advantage over its much bigger rivals is at the bottom.
Other countries may have a similar kind of narrow trajectory through your schoolboys into your academies. They just don't have as many people bundling in at that beginning point.
It's quite a rugged sort of a game that suited the early pioneers of New Zealand, and these days it provides opportunity now for young people coming out of perhaps some of the...
Look at this kid! Dang! This kid's going to be an All Black. He's got the attitude.
out of perhaps some of the more difficult socio-economic areas of New Zealand.
So the All Blacks dominate rugby because New Zealand transformed it into a game for everyone. But whether or not their domination continues, is up for debate.
Huge World Cup upset. His men are too good for the All Blacks.
In 2019, the All Blacks failed to make the World Cup finals. Then in 21 and 22, they lost a stretch of 6 out of 8 tests, which pushed them to an all-time low ranking of 5th in the world. It led some to
5th in the world is still really good. Don't beat yourself up.
which pushed them to an all-time low ranking of 5th in the world. It led some to speculate that the All Blacks were in decline and question whether they could continue to dominate world rugby. Blame was placed on the COVID pandemic and the All Blacks coach Ian Foster. Most importantly, though, the losses forced New Zealanders to reflect on how their country's relationship with rugby is changing. A 2018 report found that the number of high school boys playing rugby was falling, while other sports were on the rise.
Badminton? Basketball is going crazy.
And phenomenal success in sports like rowing, basketball, but they've taken away athletes who once upon a time would have been All Blacks.
Like a lot of kind of male prevalent sports, they then start to take on that identity of like real heavily masculine spaces, which isn't necessarily what people want to be around. It's become out of step with younger New Zealanders.
And many worry that high school rugby is increasingly dominated by a few privileged schools that are making the game too professional at the expense of the rest. A 2013 investigation found that 5 schools in Auckland are estimated to have spent $400,000 on their rugby teams, while their competitors spent only $50,000.
Wow.
Over the next 5 years, the number of Auckland high school rugby teams fell from 225 to 181.
It's become very elitist, with the schools really focusing on the elite teams. What happens to all the players who aren't good enough to play for the first team?
Just a lot of pressure when you're 15. So we're starting to see people realize, oh, well, this isn't working out here. We need to be changing things.
The most immediate challenge keeping the All Blacks from total domination, though, is the rest of the world. The rivals are getting better, particularly France and Ireland. Additionally, professional rugby leagues in Europe and Asia are getting very popular, and they're attracting a lot of New Zealand's players, making them ineligible to play for the All Blacks.
And even the lure of that black jersey for some players simply isn't enough when they think they can set themselves up for life.
In England, you've got a couple of Kiwis that are over there. If you look at the European teams, same thing there. Japan, currently run by a New Zealander. We put our people everywhere, and then we're surprised when they start to know our tricks.
So while the loss of these players may hurt the All Blacks' ability to win tests, it does ensure that New Zealanders will continue to remain at the cutting edge of rugby well into the future. Now, even though the popularity of boys rugby may be falling in New Zealand, the popularity of women's rugby there is exploding, and the women's All Blacks team is number 2 in the world.
Wow. Congrats, New Zealand, for having an amazing rugby team. It makes sense. It's like it's a little pressure cooker for rugby players. This kind of reminds me of where I grew up in Florida. In the southeast United States, football is so huge. It's ingrained in the culture. That's really all there was to play football or watch football. The high school football team was really good because that's all they could do. That's all there was to do. Play football or become part of the football pageantry. I was in the marching band, so I didn't play football, but it was a similar thing where the whole culture revolves around this game and it creates really good players at a young age. I think it's almost better that the All Blacks don't win every game. You know, they need some ebb and flow in their wins to keep the fans interested, to keep the games interesting. If they dominated every game, it would be really boring. So I think they're riding the cusp pretty well. New Zealand, good luck in the World Cup. You got what it takes, I'm sure. Really interesting. Congrats, New Zealand, on a great team for a long time. Really great video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Later.